I wasn't a detective for long. There was one case in particular that made my final decision to leave the team. A little girl reported her parents dead after experiencing a traumatic event. Of course, we all believed her to be hallucinating out of fear. But soon I found out she was telling the truth. The girl was around the age of 9 and watching television later than she should be. She said the TV suddenly started to static, so she hid under her blanket. When she peeked out, she swore she could see a face in the TV. She cried and ran to her parents' room screaming. She swung the door open and she saw her parents sleeping all the way under the covers. Her parents weren't moving. She tugged at the covers until she realized that her parents had bought white sheets, not red ones. The covers fell off the bed, and what she saw would haunt the girl for life. There laid her parents' corpses, all littered with strange symbols she couldn't recognize cut into their skin. Their eyes were slit open, and so were their throats. She turned away from the corpses and ran to the door, only to be stopped by someone standing in the doorway. She described her to be black-haired and pale. She had a lot of cuts, and her eyes weren't normal. They were static. Of course, we didn't believe her eyes were static. It was impossible. We figured she just wanted her moment of spotlight, and we cut her a break. Her parents just died after all. The woman lunged at the small child and captured her in a chokehold. She was scared. She squirmed and kicked, but nothing worked. Apparently, the police station next door had heard the ruckus and busted in. They told me when they walked in, they saw the little girl lying on the floor crying and her dead parents on the bed. The little girl frantically explained the woman killed her parents and tried to kill her, but ran out the window. They took the child into custody for a while, trying to find a center or home for her. In the time she was in the station, I was able to interview her. She still seems shaken about the event. I sat her down across the table from me. Okay? Can you explain to me what happened again? I asked. She looked up at me with wide eyes, glossed over with fear. She only shook her head and buried her head into the stuffed rabbit she held. I sighed and rested my face in my hand. Can you at least describe what she looked like to me? She nodded and looked up at me again. She had dark black hair. She had a scar on her nose, and her eyes weren't normal. She shuddered. I asked her to elaborate on her eyes. She just said the single word, static. After a minute, I dismissed her, and she ran off to her temporary room. No less than a day later, she was placed into her new home, and we hadn't heard from her again. I tried to do further research into the case, but we hadn't had any reports of women with static eyes. I dropped the case and decided to begin researching my newest one. 2 boys in the woods found dead. When the cops found their bodies, they had symbols carved all over their bodies as well. I looked at the images. The symbols seemed to be foreign but familiar to me. My eyes widened and I quickly sifted through my files to find the static case. I pulled the photograph of the girls' parents' bodies. They had the same symbols carved as the boys. I researched all over the internet for something similar. I found something that appeared to be the same symbols carved into the bodies. Thebian. It's known as the witch language. I studied the symbols and tried to compare them to the corpses, and it worked. It was a match. Across all 4 corpses' chests wrote what is pasted below, which translated to static. My eyes widened in fear. Static? I looked at the other symbols littering the bodies. All in different places, but if you arrange them in a certain order, they read, "You're next." I shook in fear. The kid was right. I quickly called my boss and called in for the night, stating I had suddenly gotten sick. I collected my stuff and got in my car. Trying to calm myself, I turned on the radio. Big mistake. The radio sputtered out white noise and I screeched, holding my ears shut. I hit the radio and it turned off. I steadied my quick breathing and looked at the road. I hadn't been paying attention and nearly hit an animal. My car swerved and crashed into a tree, the tree being next to Minnie. I was in a forest. I groaned and stumbled out of the car, shaking my phone to try and get it working. It only showed static. I paced around the forest, trying to find my way out. My home was still far from here. I guess I should walk. I began to collect my things from my car. I turned around and screamed. I came face to face with a thing that had put me in this situation. My vision was blurry at the edges, and I was beginning to see spots. The thing smiled demonically and pulled out a knife. As she did so, I finally lost touch and fell out of consciousness. The last thing I saw was static. A sharp pain in my chest woke me up. I looked down. After I regained my sight, I choked on air. The symbol carved on my chest was none other than static, written in Theban. I shook with fear. Why had she not killed me? Did she just want me to suffer? I then took time to look around my surroundings. I was back in my office. It was a wreck. Papers from my case files were scattered all around the room. Several drawers were opened and the files were messy and disorganized. 3 files laid on my desk. The files were half burnt. 2 of them were the static cases I was working on previously. I picked up the 3rd file. It was the case of Nix Taylor. I stared in confusion. This file was from last year. She was a young girl of age 17 who murdered her father and went missing afterwards. We gave up on that case because she was nowhere to be found. Why was this case on my desk? I gasped as it clicked in my head. Nix was the murderer of the 4 people we found. The lights began to flicker until turning off, and I realized how dark it was outside. I heard someone chuckle behind me. I quickly spun around, but hissed in pain due to the strain of the cuts on my chest. I looked at the figure staring at me. Her eyes seemed to glow like a TV screen as they showed me pure static. I backed away in horror until I froze, having backed myself into the wall. She walked closer to me, and I tried to quickly plan my way out of this situation, still actively avoiding hurting myself too bad. She lunged at me, and I jumped out of the way. I bolted to my office door and tried to open it, but I still had to unlock it. In the split second it took to unlock the door, she had already pinned me to the door and pulled out a sharp object. She carved a symbol into my neck, as I was still conscious. After finishing, she pulled out a pistol and shot me in the shoulder. I passed out with the shock and awake the next moment in the hospital bed. I had bandages wrapping my chest, neck, and shoulder blade. I looked around, still in a daze. The nurse came in, as well as one of my co-workers at the station. The nurse showed me an image of the symbols carved on my neck. I later knew the symbols to mean "not over." The nurse helped me sit up, and the detective asked me questions, and I answered them. I told him the little girl was right. I told everyone. Even when I recovered from my injuries, I still told the same story. No one believed me. I don't know how I'm still alive, but if you're reading this, please help me in any way you can. I don't know what's happening, or if I'm even going to be alive for much longer, but all I know is I quit my job, and I might get evicted from my home, but that's the least of my concerns. I don't even know if I'm going to live long enough to publish this. She is still on the loose, and still killing. Please be safe, everyone.